Hey everyone, hope you're enjoying the show at Pivot 2021. So excited to be here. I am Collin McLelland. I am the co-founder, CEO of Digital Wildcatters. Give you a little bit of a background on myself. I spent 10 years in the oil and gas industry, drilling and completing wells all over the United States, from the deep water Gulf of Mexico all the way up to the North Slope of Alaska and everything in between. Today, my company, Digital Wildcatters, is focused on media around energy tech. So with that said, I'm super excited about today's conversation and talking about the catalyzing role that venture capital plays in geothermal. Today, we have a super stacked panel for you with some of the top VC firms in the space. So without further ado, let's start making some introductions and get this conversation rolling. First person that we got on the panel today is Alex Helling, CEO of Baseload Capital. Alex, how are you doing? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you very much, Colin. It's a pleasure to join this panel. And no, I'm good. I'm actually in Reykjavik out visiting geothermal sites, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Baseload Capital. And we're an investment entity, so we're not really a VC. So we have raised a lot of VC capital and set the structure where we invest in early stage geothermal projects focused on low and medium temperature enthalpy. And we're both investing, and we're also having our own development companies in Iceland, the US, Japan, and Taiwan. So it's a pleasure to join this panel.
Awesome. It's great to have you here. Our next panelist is Johanna Wolfson, principal at Prime Impact Fund. Johanna, it's great to have you here. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Collin. It's great to be here. So as Collin mentioned, I'm with Prime Impact Fund. We're an early stage seed fund investing exclusively in companies that are really big swings at large scale climate impact. And what's probably most unique about us is that we use what we call catalytic capital, which is very long-term, patient, impact-first capital to support companies at a stage where they might not yet be a fit for conventional investment, but that can really, with us, prove their value as a company and progress to that next stage. We're really excited about geothermal as an area. We made our first investment in geothermal earlier this year and definitely looking to do more. So looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. We'll have some great conversation or questions for you, I'm sure. Next guest, we have DeWitt, general partner at the Engine. Ann, how are you doing today? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey, Colin, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm DeWitt, as Colin mentioned. I'm a GP at the Engine. The Engine is an early stage venture firm that was built by MIT. We're a startup ourselves. We're about 4 years old with about 500 million under management, and we're investing in solutions to the world's biggest problems that are being solved by mission-driven, kind of tough tech founders. And certainly the challenge of climate change is something that we're deeply interested in, as well as invested in. We're unusual in the sense that we ourselves have a mission as the Engine, and we're also looking for those teams looking to achieve their own missions in solving climate change. Looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Ann. And then last but not least, we have Stuart Coleman, who's actually here in Houston, Texas, along with me, venture principal at the one and only Chevron. Stuart, how are you doing today?
Good, Colin. Really appreciate the invite to participate on this panel, and I'm glad that you're taking on the task to moderate. Should be a fun discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And Stuart, I think I saw on your LinkedIn that you're actually a petroleum engineer by trade. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. So I got my undergraduate degree from the University of Mississippi in geological engineering, and then went to grad school at UT in petroleum engineering. So obviously kind of a good fit for geothermal, given all the subsurface risk that we take on developing these geothermal assets. But for us in Chevron Tech Ventures, we're kind of the venture capital and innovation arm of Chevron, and within that organization, we have two investment teams. There's one that's around our future energy fund. They're on their second fund. They just announced that second fund of 300 million earlier this year. And they're focused on things like electrification, autonomous driving, fusion, battery technology, things that are on that 5, 10, 15-year horizon, either to enhance or potentially disrupt, our business. And you would think that, geothermal would fit under their umbrella, but in fact, it falls under us on the core venture capital team. So we're kind of the original team. We're on our 8th fund. And the reason that geothermal fits with us is because, like myself and others on the team, we're petroleum engineers. We've worked in other parts of Chevron, and there's a lot of core competencies that we have in Chevron that are really applicable to geothermal, both from an investment due diligence standpoint, but also in terms of evaluating the scalability of these technologies into our operations. So looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks for that. So I want to get this conversation kicked off with, when people think about venture capital, they think about software investments, Uber, Airbnb, Slack. They don't necessarily default to thinking about geothermal. So I really want to start this conversation off is kind of getting in the inside of the mind of all of y'all's thesis around geothermal and what got you interested in geothermal, or what got your firm interested in geothermal. Johanna, why don't you go ahead and get us kicked off with that and let us know how you guys got started with this.
Sure. So we got interested in geothermal because it's a really critical part of meeting our mission in climate. So if we are serious about deep decarbonization, we know that we need, low and zero carbon baseload power, and geothermal is one of a handful of solutions, alongside nuclear and renewables plus long duration storage that can really deliver that. So it's kind of on the docket for us to figure out, and if we want to meet our climate mission. So from a high level, we were interested. Then it kind of came to the other part of your question about what would be the right role for us. As you said, geothermal is perhaps not a traditional venture fit. There are certainly exceptions, and you have some of those gathered on the call here today, but all of us as investors who are on this panel have some, kind of unique attribute. And so as we looked into the geothermal sector, we were interested in understanding what were the areas of, particular interest to us. We see, companies developing new drilling technologies. We see companies, developing new sensor and exploration technologies. We see companies in advanced geothermal, we see closed loop companies. So we kind of did an analysis of all of these opportunities and came to the conclusion that for us as Prime, where we're kind of looking for our unique role, we were especially interested in kind of retiring risk during the exploration stage. That was one area that popped up to us. That is what led to an investment in Zanskar earlier this year, which is our first geothermal investment. That company is retiring exploration risk using predictive tools. Very exciting. We're also very excited about closed loop geothermal and continue to kind of look at that. And that's not at the exclusion of other geothermal innovations, but those are two areas that really emerged as the right fit for us in terms of where we could be uniquely additive. Either because there was maybe, underinvestment in the area, or because there was a need for our style of catalytic capital.
Yeah, I also want to mention that y'all invested in Lilac Solutions, which is kind of an ancillary product to geothermal. It's a lithium extraction technology that's being used out on geothermal plants. So it seems like y'all have found different wedges into the industry. That's
right. And, of course, we're co-invested in Lilac along with the engine, represented here by Anne. And our investment in Lilac is a good example of that. We also invested early on in QuidNet Energy, which is not geothermal, but it's, subsurface, using the subsurface as a storage mechanism for energy. So we have kind of been interested in this subsurface area for some time and developed at least some investment side expertise, and have been excited to branch into geothermal.
Awesome, thanks for that. And why don't you tell us a little bit about the engine and how y'all got involved in geothermal and what y'all's thesis is?
Yeah, I think I'd echo a lot of what Johanna mentioned in terms of, the options that we have for global scale solutions and the time frame we need them are relatively limited. So I think that's also part of what we see as well in terms of how do we get the terawatt conversion if just for the US we're going to convert from kind of carbon heavy, and we, some think we're going to electrify everything. So agree that there's not many options, to really look at carefully. For us, I think very similar. It's an approach of how many ways can we go after these solutions that at global scale would work. And I think it's particularly important to figure out how do we use, talent and expertise and partnership of companies who really understand deployment at global scale. So I think that's where, how can we use all the goodness, I'd say, that we have in oil and gas that we've developed over, let's call it 125 years. How do we actually use that knowledge to, change the way that we think about where we get our energy in, from our sources, and then how that's deployed, even thinking about, can we use heat to heat in geothermal rather than, heat to electricity and potentially back to heat. So for us, Lilac Solutions, which Johanna mentioned, QuidNet team, I think is great. I really love Joe, even though we're not an investor. So I like that as well. And for ourselves, our investment is in a company called Quays, which is doing very deep supercritical geothermal. And we've put that alongside of Commonwealth Fusion Systems, a nuclear fusion focused company, alongside grid scale battery storage and Form Energy. So I think very similar. How do we kind of intersect our energy chain, right up front, so we're not finding a bunch of point solutions for all those terawatt hours we're using, in our phones and everything else.
Great. And Alex, over at Baseload Capital, as you mentioned, y'all aren't traditional VC in this sense. It sounds like y'all are more involved with actually deploying power plants and operating. Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, the man himself right now is out visiting geothermal locations as we speak, so he's definitely about that. How did you get into this, and what is y'all's thesis at Baseload?
I'd say it's a good question, but now the whole company is based on geothermal and the geothermal ecosystem, right? So it all basically started in Reykjavik 6 years ago, and I come from a project finance background. I was then working as head of finance for a technology company called Coleman, and what we realized back then was that with new technologies such as new technologies in power generation, in drilling space, in how you do the exploration, and all those new technologies can bring geothermal, and especially the area we focus on, low and medium enthalpy, into much more scalable solution. So you can take, by investing in this field, and you can build portfolios of projects instead of single risk projects. And what is needed is actually a lot of capital in order to get this started, because it's expensive to build and implement these new technologies. So basically, when we started the company, we wanted to create an investment entity that can support developers locally to utilize new technologies in order to faster deploy geothermal power plants. But what we also realized along the way is that there are very few players in this field that are actually professionally developing low and medium enthalpy geothermal resources in a professional and a global way. So that's also when we then said that, okay, in some key markets, we will also go in and do the development ourselves. So it's kind of a hybrid where we identify new technologies that can speed up the deployment of geothermal power plants in all different areas, but then also providing the platform where we can bring in that technology and actually put it to use directly in those projects. So it's a very interesting field, and I think it's good. The last couple of years, the amount of new companies that are entering the field that come in with the but that will bring down the capex cost. How can we utilize closed loop systems? How can we utilize the drilling technologies in traditional hydrothermal resources in order to build even better power plants? And how do we bring the whole industry onto the map? Like I'm from Sweden, right? So if you ask someone what is renewable energy in Sweden, they will say wind and solar. No one will say geothermal, even though 60% of all the households in Sweden actually have heat ground to heat pumps installed, but they don't know that that is, the same system, only that it's heat instead of power generation. So I think that not only do we need to focus on producing green electricity from geothermal resources, but also, how do we build out the full ecosystem? How do you combine that geothermal resource, but connecting that to district heating, or connecting that to greenhouses, or to hydrogen production? How can you also utilize the idle wells that you have all over the planet today, where you have off-grid solutions, and how you can build microgrids? So all of these are things that we look into. But so yeah, that's what we do.
Great. I'm going to veer off the path here a bit. And Stuart, I'm going to wrap you into this question. We're getting some great questions from the audience. So I'm going to start firing them off at you guys. So this first question I'm going to ask is, would a climate fund like Prime partner with an oil and gas venture fund like Chevron on geothermal investments? Is there precedent for this in prior geothermal deals? And I want to throw out there, Alex, Stuart, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Baseload has a letter of intent with Chevron to build a pilot project on an old Chevron oil and gas well. So let's talk about this. Let's get some discussion going. Johanna, they called you out on impact. Would y'all ever partner with Chevron? Let's talk about it.
So I love this question. Thanks for asking it. Thanks for going for it. So probably someone else is best positioned to speak to the precedent. I believe the answer is yes, but as to a specific transaction, someone else might be better placed. But the way we think about this at Prime, and we talk about it a lot, is we are always trying to find the fastest and most direct path to large scale impact. Like, that is our number one priority, full stop. And that could certainly include partnering in some way with an oil and gas company. We would do that if it were the best thing for the company to reach scale quickly. I anticipate that in order to reach conviction on that point, we would really want to understand the company's strategy and priorities and how that partnership would unfold. We would certainly ask questions about that, but we could gain conviction around that as the path to large scale, fast impact. And if so, we would be supportive of that.
Alex,
yeah, very good. I can just also add in, I think it's necessary that we get all the, not only Chevron, but all the oil and gas players into this field with all the knowledge that they have. And, just as an example, I think 2019, there were 200 geothermal wells drilled in 1 year. I think the same year it was over 70,000 oil and gas wells drilled. So, just looking at that scale, we need to utilize the knowledge sitting with companies such as Chevron and the other players in order to speed up the transition for geothermal, and in order to bring down the costs and better understanding the subsurface risk and developing these power plants.
And something that I should have mentioned, because it's kind of in the same topic, but along with our kind of analysis of the path to impact, we would also ask the question, like, what is the risk of the technology being used for oil and gas extraction? And that definitely could vary depending on what type of geothermal innovation it is. So, some geothermal innovations in EGS and exploration are really coming over from the oil and gas space, where they are well developed, and it's about adapting those for geothermal. There's kind of not as much of a risk of those being so-called co-opted by the oil and gas industry, and partnering with an oil and gas company is more likely in the spirit of that oil and gas company developing, an alternate business line, versus some new drilling, physics that we might, look at supporting that hasn't yet been adopted by the oil and gas industry. Those might be at higher risk for what we would call mission, going off mission. So that would factor into. I just wanted to mention that.
Stuart, how does Chevron look at this, from the other side, being at the majors? How do they see partnerships with some of these other impact funds and startups in the geothermal space?
Yeah, I mean, I hope the answer is yes, right? I mean, we're here, we want to be part of the solution. We have a lot of expertise that can be, very valuable towards scaling geothermal technology. And not only do we have an LOI with Baseload Capital, but we're also investors. We led the round earlier this year. Really liked Alex and his team and their approach towards the development of geothermal assets. So we're excited to be on that journey, and on that journey with us is, Breakthrough Energy Ventures. They're co-investors with us in Baseload Capital, and I would consider them, very close peers to Prime and the Engine with very similar remits. So I think, they certainly understand that it's going to take, a multitude of different types of investors and types of people with different expertise to really come together and solve, that next level of problems that needs to be solved for geothermal to get from, 0.2% of the energy to even 10% of the energy mix. So yeah, we hope the answer is yes.
Maybe I'll just chime in.
Yeah.
I fully, this is an exciting conversation, but I think it will be very interesting to watch what evolves in terms of the management teams of these really exciting innovation companies that are going to be leading for us. I suspect many of them will actually be coming out of oil and gas or the services that support it, such as drilling. And I think they're the ones who also deeply feel that how we are going to do this transition and can do something about it. We already have some executives that are actually out of that. Carlos at Quays, 15-year Schlumberger. I know some of most of that team is also sort of out of that. I think the QuidNet team, Johanna, if I remember, is also coming with a lot of knowledge. So I think the partnership and understanding who's going to be a good partner to achieve, what we're all, I think, trying to achieve for sort of the planet will be good. It's just who's going to be on the forefront of pushing that innovation forward versus kind of, following others. So I hope that there'll be many who will want to be at the forefront and really in partnership with these innovative companies as we're trying to figure out what solutions are really going to work for us.
Awesome. So we have some more questions rolling in here, and I'm going to kind of combine this one with a question that I had. So when you look at geothermal, it's a high risk business, much like oil and gas was decades ago and still is. But with the shale revolution in oil and gas, you started to de-risk the operations of drilling and completions with this so-called manufacturing process. And once that started happening, you had private equity start rolling in and deploying billions of dollars of capital into the space. Right now, geothermal is still too risky for private equity to come in. So you have this funding gap. And my question is venture capital the right fit to fill that gap? And to kind of fuse this with one of the questions from the audience, are y'all ready to stay the course for, say, a 5 to 10 year time frame with your fund?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So let's elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So I think on capitalization, obviously a fun topic for investors. So one, I think there can be the emergence of fund structures that allow for that. So, from an Engine's perspective, the way the LPs that we have attracted and the way that we're structured is an 18-year fund. So very clear when we were raising capital that we could take a longer look at foundational companies because they may not all emerge in a 5 to 7 year window, which is a typical structure for a venture fund. So I think that's something that we'll start seeing. I think the more activation around different ways to think about the vehicles that are actually doing the investing. And I'd say we're an example of that just at the Engine. I think the other element that I'm also excited about, and I'm sure others are the engagement of government, and I think we've seen some programs get fired up pretty quickly, that's going to allow not only kind of the SBR sizes and maybe some of the original and what we have today with some of the couple $1 million kind of grants, but something that allows much more capital deployment and in partnership with other funding sources with the government. So I think that that's also going to be important in opening up some partnerships such as with the national labs in order to go faster and bringing together sort of groups that have drilling expertise. For example, they have a geothermal site and government has a piece of technology. So I think it's going to take trying to figure out where everyone's going to play, make sure we're able to draw in large capital investors, that this is in fact a good investment that you can get a return on. So we're going to need some successes. But I think if we can start getting those pieces in place and understanding kind of who's going to partner with whom and at what stage of the capital stack, I'm pretty excited. There's already the group here and many others that we've co-invested with that have been mentioned to start building up that capital stack that we need around these investments.
And I'll jump in with a couple complementary points. I think it's an important point that these projects aren't really yet considered viable for private equity or project finance. I will say, I think I mentioned earlier on that part of our investment thesis was around looking for opportunities for risk and cost reduction during resource development. That's in part to make those with the thesis that could make geothermal projects in general more financeable. So like I mentioned, that's part of why we made the investment that we did. Separate to that, though, to your question, Collin, about is venture the right type of capital? It could be, okay for some early small scale projects. I don't think venture is the right style of capital, for anything larger, and certainly it's not a long-term plan. And we do thinking with all of our kind of project-based companies about what is that right blend of equity and debt, and how do you start gaining access to debt, and when. And I think to Anne's point, I mean, there are now some funds coming online and some even not formal funds, but just capital providers who are a bit more creative in their thinking about mixing corporate equity and access to debt capital in interesting ways. And I think that'll be, something good to keep watching. And at Prime, we're actually undergoing an exploration on how do we use catalytic capital. So the same sort of capital that we currently use for venture investing, sourced from philanthropic and other sources. How do we use that to enable first of a kind projects? And that's, an effort that will unfold, but would certainly be relevant to the types of companies we're talking about here.
Very good. If I can just add on as well, from Baseload Capital perspective, I think that the support from VCs and starting up the company have been vital. So and of course, since we both invest and build and operate power plants, we need quite a lot of capital. So I think that what we could do early on was to raise very patient VC capital that wanted to take part in investing in new technologies and using that new technologies to deploy it, to actually prove it. And I think that the one what we can see here in Iceland, for example, is that we used those initial funds. We built our first 2-3 power plants, and then after only 1.5 years with technology that was not bankable, we could then refinance that locally with a bank here on Iceland. So I would say that VCs for us have been extremely important to kickstart the whole business model and to start building our platform. Then I think that if we look at the PE side, because we're discussing with the investors in Asia, in Europe, and in the US, when it comes to projects that are operational and when you have de-risked them, then the finding and identifying money won't be an issue. There are so many investors that looking for those long-term cash flows, but it's the way to get there. And I think that's where you need all the different parts of the VCs, everything from micro VCs when you start up to an idea to VC growth investors when you actually get a bit business models live. So I would say that it's needed.
Stuart, someone from the audience commented that it's a bit ironic that Chevron used to have a great presence in geothermal and had a nice geothermal portfolio, divested, and now y'all are re-engaging. They wanted to know if you could comment on that. And then my question also is, how does Chevron and the other major oil and gas companies look at investing in geothermal projects? You'd mentioned that y'all had invested in Baseload's projects. Is this something that's becoming a heavy emphasis internally at the major oil and gas companies? And do you think that that could be a source of capital for these capital intensive projects?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to, our divestment of the geothermal assets. I think that was 2014. I was not involved in that, but, obviously that traditional geothermal has been limited to those areas of the world where, hot rock is close to the surface. It's cheap to drill, and it's very high enthalpy. So that has kind of really restricted the growth and potential of geothermal. So in this iteration, if you look at our investments, both in Baseload and Ever that we made this year, and what we'll look at in the future, are things that are going to take it to the next level, right? What are the technologies that are going to enable geothermal to be competitive on a much more meaningful level within the power markets, right? And that can be things like closed loop, right? That's an emerging technology, still comes with a lot of risk, which I think, kind of to the prior question, is a good fit for venture capital. Alex spoke about low and medium enthalpy resources. If you can get to lower temperature and still produce power, that opens up a much larger aperture of viable geothermal resources. So if you look at our iteration of investments here, they're venture flavored, and we're really looking at what the emerging technologies are out there to get geothermal to a much more meaningful level within the power markets.
Great, thanks. And we have another question here. I'm going to fuse this with one of my questions also. And the question is, one of the main challenges scaling up geothermal is getting first of their kind demonstration projects and power plants funded. So you're looking at between a $20 and $50 million investment. This is the funding valley of death right now for geothermal startups. And this kind of plays into some context that I have from oil and gas tech. These tech startups always struggled with early stage financing. There was just a vacuum of early stage capital. But the one benefit that startups had in oil and gas was that there was a lot of oil and gas activity, like Alex mentioned earlier, just the scale of oil and gas activity compared to geothermal. You just had the distribution there. So if you can manage to raise some capital, develop a product, and get a pilot, you had a chance of success. Geothermal doesn't have that benefit of having a lot of geothermal project activity to go and distribute their product to. So these founders face a lot of resistance while trying to get their product to market, even if they do manage to raise capital and develop. So how do y'all's firms think about those types of risk? And do you have any solutions for founders that are trying to bridge that gap? That's a tough question. Who wants to take that one?
I can start.
Go ahead, Alex.
No, but this is more from a baseload capital perspective and focused on low and medium enthalpy resources. But we speak to a lot of both project developers and founders with new technology, especially in the closed loop areas. And I think that from our perspective, it's the difficult part is to validate the technologies, because there are also not that good of if you take all the technical consultants, for example, to validate these types of new resources, where you have to drill, for example, a 4,000 meter well, and then you can do the testing. It's a lot of upfront risk that you have to take. So what we try to do when we discuss this and look at these projects is to see also, can we find suitable grants that can take away some of that risk to do a pilot project, for example. We have here on Iceland, we want to do a combined geothermal greenhouse development, and there you have two technologies that you combine together, but then there's also a lot of grants that can support to take the first step and also be the simplify the investment. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's how we look at it, and try to figure out and support the founders in how can we find a viable way of not only us investing and supporting and running the project, but can we also find other ways of sourcing that will support the founder to drive the pilot project forward.
This is such a complicated topic. Maybe just to take a different angle, I think in a weird way, the world is kind of awash in capital right now. Everyone's trying to figure out where they're going to put their capital to get a return. So one, I think that it's an interesting moment because a lot of public capital, as we've seen, have been moving more private, and the amount of capital that's maintained in sort of the private sector has been growing incredibly. So I think that that capital is there. I think coming to education of investors and being able to clearly describe risk, I think is a unique skill set among the CEOs and founders that are ambitious enough to go after these projects, and being able to again, I'll just sort of take a different approach of the opportunity here is huge. It's like very rare does like $1 trillion opportunity kind of come along, right? And so that's kind of what we're looking at. But that's a hard story for people to kind of wrap their minds around, and also to understand what the risk is and what's going to be demonstrated against that risk. It's a fairly technical field, and if you're trying to get capital from, I'll call it more generalist investors versus very sort of technical expert early stage folks, you've got to kind of describe that in a different way and be able to outline the risk. And maybe I think a challenge for the CEOs and the executive teams and the founders is to figure out, are there ways to break apart that risk, to work with partners so that you can move more quickly to showing that you can knock down that risk. So just to take a slightly different angle, I'd say there's a real opportunity to describe the opportunity with geothermal, and how do we do a better job of describing the risk, breaking it apart to help more generalist investors understand the types of risks and returns that we're looking at with these projects.
Yeah, I really agree with everything Anne just said. And, thinking about, so how do companies traverse this second valley of death, kind of the demonstration phase, and how do investors get over that too? I think the hard thing about that question is that there really is not a playbook. There is not one discrete way to do that. And that's a hard thing right now. But it is kind of an opportunity, because those companies that are able to sort of construct their set of lily pads to get all the way there could be very successful. And that could be, how do you fund those things? It could be some combination of, state funding and strategic involvement, off a corporate balance sheet, and some kind of special, more risk-taking early debt vehicles. Could involve companies being more creative with their business model, right? And do one thing for some time while you partner to get projects together and share revenues off that, while you bridge to a different, until you're in a position to be an asset owner yourself. And so I think that, that kind of creativity and revenue models will be an important part of companies getting to demonstration as well.
I would just add to that, if you look at getting geothermal to a utility scale, right, where it can compete with natural gas and other forms of baseload power that are already out there, there's some wins that can be had along the way, right? I think Alex mentioned it, existing infrastructure where there might be low temperature. Our LOI is in the San Joaquin Valley, where we're doing steam flooding, right? We're already putting significant amount of energy into the subsurface to extract oil, and we're producing hot fluid. So we use some technology to lower the carbon intensity of our operations and start to demonstrate some of those technologies bit by bit. right? I think Ever is looking at Arctic communities. These are communities that are, isolated from traditional power grids and infrastructure where they have to truck in diesel to essentially power their communities, right? So geothermal can already compete on an LCOE basis with those types of communities and those types of areas. So I think there is, even though drilling a well is expensive and it's a big undertaking and there's a lot of risk, there are some earlier wins that can be had along the way for geothermal to really get to that large utility scale.
Great, thanks for that. And so we got a question from the audience. They said, this is interesting because we're introducing two different cultures almost and asking them to get married in a funding relationship, talking about climate philanthropists and oil and gas teams pursuing geothermal. Any thoughts from the panel about how to bridge this, or if this is even a concern in practice? And this plays into a question I had for y'all as well. It sounds like everyone on this panel wants to leverage the technical expertise and experiences from oil and gas. But how do the climate impact funds as a whole feel about the fusion between oil and gas and clean energy, such as geothermal? Do y'all see it being a problem in the first place?
I think there's skepticism, right? I think that the history of oil and gas renewables efforts is an up and down history of those coming into favor and falling out of favor. And so I think I would say there's a skepticism that doesn't, for us, that doesn't necessarily translate to, kind of religion one way or the other. As I shared earlier, we would, we could certainly be supportive of partnerships if we were convinced that that was the path to impact. But I think the skepticism is probably warranted. But, I think surmountable, especially, these things often end up being about people and, coming around together as co-investors around a company that we really believe in. And once you get to that level and you really understand why does this fit within the company strategy, the strategic strategy that is, it could make sense. I don't know if we could, well, at least I am not probably in a position to speak, to all climate impact funds. I can share that that's how we would think about it. Again, as a case by case basis, there certainly are probably funds that, might stay away from it as a rule, maybe more for optics reasons than practical ones. But I think as Alex shared earlier, there are good examples, BEV and others kind of co-investing. And I think, good examples of these worlds colliding beneficially.
Great. We have some questions rolling in that are related more to the operations of y'all's funds. So start firing off some of these questions. What is the turnaround time from intro to funding for your entities? Are we talking weeks, months to make funding decisions? How long is that turnaround time usually in the geothermal startup space?
I think it depends on it depends on what that looks like when it walks in the door. Just from where we are, when Carlos, who's the CEO of Quays, I'll just do it by example. Carlos was actually the technical director of the engine, and Carlos was looking at a set of technologies out of the MIT Plasma Science and Fusion Center, which sort of gave birth to both Commonwealth Fusion as well as Quays. So by the time sort of Quays got started and he met Aaron Mandel and Vinod Khosla and understood what was happening at Alterac, and then they looked at what was happening at the Plasma Science and Fusion Center and thought, hey, there's a new way to think about what the opportunity is in geothermal with this millimeter wave drilling technology. So that was a long process to identifying from like a technology breakthrough standpoint, and that academic body of work had been going on for a decade behind that. At the point when the company had actually been formed and then started talking about what was the right way to really capitalize that company, those discussions could move relatively quickly. I'd say in part because we understood because Carlos was one of us at the Engine. We understood how he made decisions, how he was going to think about team building. We understood who the first set of, what the founders were going to look like and what their orientation was to building the company. So, that can be a relatively fast process. If it's a highly technical underwriting, for us, we do that technical diligence because we invest in sort of breakthrough academic institutional research. So that takes, typically takes, 4 to 6 weeks, can take longer depending on the complexity of the technology. But, also if we need to see if they're new founders that we've just met, really understanding that founding team, why are they doing what they're doing? How do they make decisions together and how do they learn together? It's all we know with innovation is that you're going to be learning together. That can take time to watch the team and engage and understand how they make decisions. So there's no one answer. We've had things go really short, 2 to 3 months. And then we've known teams for 2 to 3 years inside of academia before they're actually ready to come out and finance as a company.
Yeah, very, very similar with us. Can be on the order of a couple of months if things move quickly from beginning to end, from first meeting to end. But we do love to meet teams really early. So if there's a group out of the university, working in an incubator, in Jamie's program that she runs, we would love to meet them early and just have an informal relationship and give advice. And that might mean we know them for years before there's even an investment to talk about. So there's quite a range.
Great. And the next question we have is, how much investment do you see coming in the next several years in geothermal, whether it's VC, private equity, oil and gas firms? This person said, let's hear some firm numbers. What are you thinking in terms of firm numbers for investment in the geothermal, let's say over the next 5 to 10 years?
That's like
you can give a guess. We won't hold you to it.
Yeah, that's like
that include like SPACs and IPOs, or?
Yeah, I think with the SPAC craze, you have to include SPACs.
Well,
I would say it's very hard to give a fixed number to that, but what we can see, or what at least we can see from Baseload Capital, from when we started the company just 4 years ago to where we are today, and the interest that we have, both from Asian investors, European investors, and American investors have grown rapidly. From when initiating discussions 4 years ago, no one knew what geothermal was, and now they actually have a program to focus and want to invest in geothermal and understand it. So I think that there will be a huge movement and a huge capital movement into geothermal, but then how big that will be, I can't answer that.
That was a good answer, Alex. I think that'll suffice. I think the rest of the panel will let you go out on the limb and answer that one. So, and we got a question specifically for you. Someone wants to know, when will we get an engine in Houston?
Wow, I would love to just talk about Houston and with, if there's any more questions or comments or insights for me. I think maybe people don't know, but I'm actually a Houston fan, in part because I've got a couple of teams. Johanna, obviously QuidNet team, but we have the Syzygy Plasmonics team and Quays, and I have just been at meeting the ecosystem in Houston. I am so excited about the potential of what that city is going to do. I mean, of the world, right, of oil and gas, and I think the commitment of that city to really figuring out like how to transition, I find very, very exciting. Again, an engine in Houston, I don't know. There's a lot of goodness in Houston. Would I be happy to invest in amazing founders that are putting their company in Houston? Absolutely. but I don't know if Houston needs an engine. There's a lot of goodness there already, but
it sounds like there's a chance. So we'll hold out hope for that happening. So we
Rice
have a good question.
Greentown Labs, Houston. I mean, there's a lot of goodness there already. So
Absolutely. We have a good question here that I think will be really insightful for founders and builders in the audience that are listening to this discussion. They ask, can you give some examples of risk which you have identified and resulted in you not investing in geothermal projects that would help the industry to get feedback on where to target improvements to access capital?
I can start on that one. I mean, I don't think it's a big surprise to the group that when I say, drilling risk is the biggest thing. We talked about kind of the unconventional growth around, the technology, the horizontal drilling, all of that came together for unconventionals. We were able to do that from a manufacturing standpoint, repeatable, and really minimizing the risk that's associated with that. So I think it's the same thing with geothermal. There's not really any specific reason that we would, say no, but I think that's kind of the big elephant in the room from a risk standpoint is just drilling costs and reservoir uncertainty, right? So those are the two that we're comfortable with as a company, but as a startup that may be cash strapped, right? You're taking on a lot of risk. There's a low margin for error on the execution of those. And so when we evaluate, these geothermal companies, geothermal projects, that's a key thing that we're honing in on is, what is the reservoir risk? What is the drilling risk? And how does that impact to cost and execution risk? So.
Yeah, and from our perspective, since we invest in projects and local developers, I would say that the main part when looking in different markets is the risk of corruption, for example, or that you don't have the right structures in place. And I think that's the main reason why we turn down projects in certain markets.
So, we tend to be very embracing of risk, especially technology risk. That's kind of our jam. But so a couple maybe orthogonal ways that we might, think about risk that we would not pursue. One could be downstream financing risk, which we've touched on a bit. So we're kind of an early catalytic fund. If we don't see a pathway for a company to sufficiently retire enough risk to then get downstream capital, that would give us pause. I can't think of any particular examples where that's happened, but it certainly could. Another one that has come up, I don't know if it answers the question exactly, but another geothermal area that we've looked at would be kind of specifically sensors, kind of advanced sensing, downhole sensing, that kind of thing, where, the technology might be good, might be solving a problem, but we have trouble seeing it kind of as a venture investing opportunity. I guess you could, think about that as returns risk, but more on the size rather than the likelihood. So that's another kind of category that comes to mind when I hear the question.
Maybe I'll chime in on a last one that was alluded to, but I'm going to just hammer on founding team and just understanding or executive team, really understanding like, how does that team work together? How do they make decisions? Like, do they have a true north? Do they have sort of a value set that's like that they're building down through the organization? So that would be just one addition I would add on, but agree with all those points. But really that founding team, do they really have a mission to build the company that they're going to build? Because it's ambitious to build companies like what we're talking about, which is awesome. But having the right ones to go down that path with you and as a founding team, I think is super important.
Awesome. So I'm sure that we could talk about geothermal for another 1 to 2 hours if we wanted to, but unfortunately we are running out of time. So we got to wrap this up real quick. Everyone, you have 1 minute to give your closing statement. If you don't have a closing statement, tell me what you're excited about in geothermal. Tell everyone, what gets you out of bed in the morning and gets you going. Johanna, we'll start with you. You got 1 minute. You're on the hot seat.
Okay. Well, what gets me excited, I didn't get much of a chance to talk about, but I mentioned our early investment in Zanskar Geothermal. And I think what I'm so excited about with that is we do think a lot about very, very future geothermal in terms of, what could enhanced geothermal bring us, what could closed loop drilling bring us. And that's exciting. But what's almost more exciting to me is sort of the really low hanging fruit on what's already underneath our feet. What the blind resources are that we're not accessing because we haven't had the exploration tools. I'm super excited about that. And then secondarily, I'm just really excited about some of the off-taker movement we're seeing. I mean, the California Public Utilities Commission did a huge procurement announcement that I think is going to be pretty game-changing for the geothermal world. So excited to watch what happens there.
Awesome. Thank you. Ann, it's your turn.
Yeah, it's about like the founders. So any sort of wicked smart founder or founding team that's just got some crazy ambition to solve the world's biggest problems, and that's going to run through brick walls and learn whatever they got to learn to do it. Every day that will get me out of work, and I will work for that founding team. So that one's easy for me. That's hands down why I do what I do, and I want to do everything I can to support those founders in building their companies.
That's great. Thanks, Ann. Alex.
Yeah, I think it's I love this work what we're doing, and I love the movement that we see in the industry with all the new companies coming, and us building a platform for how we can deploy new technologies, and actually when we have finished a project and put the power plant online, knowing that developed correctly, that power plant will be there forever producing green baseload power. I just think that's amazing. And finding ways on how we can scale that up to what Stuart said, utility scale. I think that that journey have just begun, and it will be extremely exciting to see what we, together with the rest of the industry and all the new players, can do over the next decades.
It's awesome. Excited to see what you're working on, Alex. Stuart.
Yeah,
last but not least, man, what do you got?
Yeah, I think this is fun. This is a very emerging area for folks that have a strong background in subsurface engineering. Lots of smart people really trying to tackle this. It's exciting to be able to meet those folks, talk with them, learn what they're really grinding on. And it's exciting because as a petroleum engineer, this is a big problem that's pretty exciting to tackle. It's like opening a new puzzle box and really figuring out, right? We got the frame, we kind of know how to do geothermal where it's easier, but how do we get those inner pieces locked together and really get this to a point where we're providing utility scale with subsurface heat? That's an exciting problem to try and solve.
Awesome. Well, everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this panel. I want to thank all of these panelists for coming on. I mean, just rock stars, and this conversation is exciting. It's exciting to see that the times that we're in and see the change that's happening, and just really seeing the evolution of the technology and geothermal. So thanks all the panelists. Thank y'all so much. Appreciate you doing this. To Pivot 2021 team, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure doing this. If y'all haven't downloaded the Collide app yet, it's been mentioned in the show previously. Just search Digital Wildcatters in the App Store. Get on the Collide app, get in the geothermal group, and let's keep the conversations going. We'll catch y'all next year.
Thanks, Collin.
Thanks, guys.
Go.